more data than but potentially not the ways that we want or expect. And so I'm going to talk today, maybe not so much about my results, but maybe more about the discussion. And I had three really distinct phases of research. So actually, before we do that, sorry, I am actually just going to, I'm just going to give you the three definitions that are offered in the literature. There's a lot more definitions of this, and they're very nuanced, but they kind of boil down to these three definitions quite often. So the first one is new purpose. So as long as you're using an existing data set with some sort of new purpose, and this is the most cited definition of reuse. Most people cite Zimmerman, particularly in the hard sciences. There's also the new author. So as long as you are a different author to the original author of the data set, that's reuse. And interestingly, my third stage of research was interviews with archaeologists, and that's the definition that most archaeologists sort of veer towards. And the third one is more of like a post-fair kind of thing, and it's about adding value. So as long as you've taken a data set, you've done something new and interesting in some sort of transformation, and you've created new knowledge and added value, that's data reuse. My personal opinion is more about this third one, about adding value. That's what I'm sort of looking at. But the one that I used for my research was the new author definition. So just kind of keep that in mind as I'm looking through these things. So I was really lucky when I started my research. I got to join Saving European Archaeology from the Digital Dark Age, which is an EU cost action. And Seaton looked at sort of all different aspects of data stewardship. And so I joined Working Group 4 that looked at the use and reuse of archaeological data. And when I joined, there'd been these conversations that, you know, sort of the topic is so broad, how will we go about tackling that? And the purpose of a cost action is not actually to come up with solutions. It's really about capacity building and sharing knowledge between countries. And so developing sort of personal networks. And so we sort of took this approach that, well, we don't actually necessarily need to solve it, but we should start and try and develop a baseline of where we could do more research from. And so we decided to look at the underlying the underlying infrastructure of search interfaces. And we sort of were asking questions like, why is it so difficult to find data? What do people do when they find gaps in the data? How do you trust the data that other people have created? And we did this through a survey. So we had a quality and use methodology that was developed by one of our members. And quality and use is actually based off an ISO standard that collects qualitative data about user experiences using software. And so we sent out a survey to our members and we asked them to go and find a data set. We gave them 3 data types. So just find a data set of one of these data types, perform some tasks, then answer some questions about your experience. And what happened was when I presented the feedback at a workshop, they said, yes, the methodology is fine, but it's really overwhelming to have to just go out and find a data set. Like there's so much out there, I don't know where to begin. And an example of this was one of our data types was 3D pottery data. So something very specific and niche. I found 29 repositories that had pottery data, but only 7 of those actually had 3D pottery data. And some of those weren't actually discipline-specific repository. So like Sketchfab, for example, has some really nice looking models, but maybe doesn't have the detail that archaeologists want. And also sometimes they're behind paywalls. So, and they're also divorced from their context occasionally as well. So they're not necessarily useful, even if they're nice and pretty to look at. And so I decided that I was going to take this feedback on and I was going to do something different for my next stage of research. And I really wanted to do interviews. And the idea was I would interview people who are actually reusing data and find out what their experience is like, maybe do a workshop and do some sort of ethnographic study. And I really was interested in collecting qualitative data. I thought that's how I'm going to understand data reuse. And I spoke to some staff at the ADS and sort of said, like, who should I approach? But their response was, well, we kind of our research, we kind of hit up the same people all the time. It would be great to find some new people. So I thought, great, if I could find half a dozen to a dozen examples of people reusing ADS data, that would be enough. And I could interview them and I could get some sort of perspective. And so the tool I decided to use for this was citation analysis. Now, I chose the ADS specifically to do a case study on to address this idea that approaching that. There's so many different repositories to go to. I'll just choose one repository as a case study. And I remember telling James, oh, this is going to take 3 weeks, this citation analysis. I'm not going to find very much. It ended up taking about 5 months. And what started off as a project just to find a couple of examples turned into something completely different. I had collected, by the end of this period, a really large quantitative data set that helped me answer some of the questions I had about reuse. I know who's reusing data. I know what they're doing with it. I am still trying to figure out why they're struggling to find the right data, but some of the questions that I had from Seaton have been answered now. So some of the challenges that I had with citation analysis specifically is that citation analysis is not a very good tool. It relies on the co-location of words. So if you put data plus reuse into a search engine, you're going to get millions of results. Even when you throw in something like ADS on top of that, you either get nothing or you get everything. But fortunately for me, very luckily, the ADS has their own DOIs. So a DOI is a digital object identifier, which is a persistent identifier that in this case, because we're looking at digital objects, is an address on the web that says where an item is located, and it remains persistent, so it should stay there. And if it has to be removed for some reason, metadata should still exist that says what used to live there before. And so because the ADS mints their own DOIs, I could use this to do a citation analysis. Within about 2 weeks of starting that, I actually had to move from spreadsheets into a database because there was just so much data I couldn't manage it on a spreadsheet anymore. And I was really surprised at just how rich and full this data set was. I'm not going to go through too many of the results today because I have presented that. Elsewhere. But just to give you a really basic understanding of what I found. So 27% of data sets are consolidated. So that's where you might go out and find 2 or 3 data sets, combine them. Sometimes you do your own data or just with those data sets to create a new data set that you can do some sort of analysis on. Now, what's interesting is this says 27%. There was a survey done recently in ecological sciences that shows that that number is as high as 63%. So potentially it could be more. But the other highest categories were spatial data, artifact or object analysis, and temporal data. And that kind of tracks because as archaeologists, we look at material culture through time and space. So is this really the best that we can do? I was so frustrated by this research to a certain extent. Yes, I found something really valuable. I never imagined that I would get to this point just from doing a citation analysis, but it shouldn't have been as hard as it was. And so despite, despite the success that I had, I was still really left thinking, like, in this day and age, with the amount of technology we have, why is this the best that we can do? And what I really came out with out from this was archaeologists are reusing data, and I think a lot more than what I've even found, but the issue is one of visibility. Part of it is citation analysis is limited, so it's very much limited to academic outputs. So in the UK, because obviously the archaeology data surface is located in the UK, 90% of archaeology is commercial. So I'm looking at 10% of what's actually going on. But also the tools that I use were Scopus and Web of Science. They're limited to what they actually index. So again, there could be more out there. But also the issue is partly with DOIs. So part of it is the responsibility of academics. So you as an academic should be, ideally, citing DOIs when you've used someone else's data set or even if you've referenced them. But it's not enough for you just to take a DOI and throw it into your reference list and have that work. Publishers have a responsibility. They actually have to build an infrastructure to make sure that those DOIs are machine readable, and they have to provide extra metadata. But also editors are partly responsible. They should be checking those DOIs and checking what goes into these references. I went in, before I did the citation analysis, I went into Oxford Academic, which I thought, yep, reputable publisher. And I just searched for Archaeology Data Service to see if anyone had put this in their references. And sometimes it's spelled Archaeology Data Service, and sometimes it's spelled Archaeological Data Service, sometimes in the same publication. And it's really frustrating, especially when you get Archaeological Data Service right next to archaeologydataservice.ac.uk. Like, yeah. So That still needs some work. Yeah. So, yeah, I think as well, part of the reason that DOIs are so important in an academic landscape is that tracking DOIs demonstrates value. So your research outputs, if someone cites them, it adds to your H index, which is related to career progression, is related to funding and things like that. So it's really important to cite using DOIs. Okay, here's an example though of when best practice is really unhelpful and is part of the problem about visibility. So Andrew Bevan from UCL created a data set using human population, food production and climate change data. It's a meta-analysis. He's taken a whole heap of different data sets and put them together. So he's written this journal article, and within that, he's written a data availability statement, and he's put in here, here's a DOI to my data set. Fantastic, best practice, absolutely, like no shade to Bevan or anything. This is all best practice. So I go into the data set and there's a few README files. And one of those README files is a reference list of all the data sets in grey literature that he looked at when he created this meta-analysis. So I went and looked for the prefix for ADS and I found 392 citations for ADS grey literature and data sets that did not come up on my reference list. In fact, this article didn't come up on my reference list when I did my citation analysis. I found this by accident when I was looking at something else. And so it just shows you the data is out there. You can use best practice, but it's still not citable or trackable. Here's another example. So this is the Newport medieval ship. It was excavated in 2002, and this data set was deposited with the ADS in 2017. It's a really rich data set. They're not all this full, but they've got specialist post-ex reports, 3D models, spreadsheets, databases, all sorts of things in here. And the ADS has given one DOI for the entire data set. So if you cite that data set, best practice is that you would cite down to the most granular level that you can. So in this instance, I have an example of Russ, who it's a post-ex report about fish remains. And someone cited this post-ex report and they cited with Russ, but used the primary DOI for the whole data set. Again, best practice, fantastic, great. The problem is that when I did the citation analysis, I found 3 references to this ADS data set. But when I go in and look at individual reports, some of them have 3 and 4 references each, but it's not citable if people haven't used the DOI and they only use the title. Unless I go and look at every individual title, I can't find any reference to it. So again, it's a visibility issue. Okay, so is this really the best that we can do? So one of the issues is the lack of clarity. So when archaeologists write about using other people's data, they don't use words like, oh, I reused this data set, or I did a secondary analysis, or it's not like a natural way that some people write. That's fine. But it would be really great if you could put 1 or 2 sentences about the fact that you use someone else's data in your methodology. That would be great. It's also a matter of definitions, and I'll give an example shortly. Depending on how you define data can depend on whether it's been used or reused. Now, the most cited data sets on the ADS that I found have visible funding. So one of them, for example, is regional reviews. So regional reviews were originally funded by, at the time, was English Heritage, now Historic England. And they are somewhere where like an archaeologist will go and find all the available data about a certain geographical region, time period, object type, something like this, and create a monograph. And often these monographs were accompanied with data sets that had been deposited with the ADS. These are highly used materials, people talk about them, and they have good visibility. Another one is the Aggregates Levy Sustainability Fund. There is a large number of projects that have been deposited with the ADS that receive funding from the ALSF. They're not necessarily reused, but they're highly cited. They're often grey literature. There are issues with whether or not grey literature is used or reused and how I can tell the difference. But it just got me to thinking about like, what is the value or what is the impact of this data being used? Doesn't matter if it's used or reused as long as we're adding value. Okay. And so this is an example of how is this use or reuse? So a data set deposited on the ADS by Guest and Wells, the Iron Age and Roman coins from Wales. Now, this has been cited twice, once by Reynolds and once by Bland et al. And they used it for to comparatively date some coins that they'd found. Now, if you use the different author definitions, both of these authors have reused this data set. But if you use the new purpose definition, in the introduction by Guest and Wells, they invite users to look at their data set and use it to comparatively date. So if you use the new purpose, then neither Reynolds or the Bland et al. Article have actually reused this data set, they've only used it. And I guess my question is, does it matter? Some authors are very pedantic about the differences between use and reuse and why it's important. But if one of the things that about reuse is that we want to add value to existing archives, we want to bring them to life, we want to reuse them again and make sure that sort of every time you use it, you're adding some value to it, then does it really matter if it's use or reuse? Okay, so this is another example, the rural settlements of Roman Britain. So this data set was created by Allen et al. And they collected 2,500 commercial excavation reports from across the UK, and they put them all together and created a database. Really well-funded project. They received £1 million almost of Leverhulme funding, and it equated to about 20 years of man-hours to create this data set. And when you go into the data set, you can actually go in and choose like a time period or a region or an object type. You then have a look at that, and you can go to the original excavation report if you want to and have a look further. Now, this is the most cited data set that I found at the ADS. This time last year, when I'd actually finished my citation analysis, there were 52 citations. I had a quick check this morning. I think it's up to about 60 as of now. And so it's been really well cited. And I guess I have a question about all of these projects that have a lot of funding are quite visible. Is there a link between visibility and funding? I think with this project, probably there was a lot of promotion because of the amount of funding, but I don't really know if there's actually a link. I haven't been able to determine that. I also think these consolidated data sets have really broad appeal, and that's part of the reason that they get reused so much. And I'm really trying to figure out, are there other reasons? I thought it might have had something to do with the data cleansing process, but I don't think that as much anymore. So I guess now I've been left with a question. So I was working from this assumption that archaeological data wasn't being reused, but I've proved to myself actually it is being reused. It's being reused quite a lot. So yes, one of the issues is visibility. But I guess what are some of the other issues? Is there something about people who reuse data that I can look at to say, how can we replicate this behavior? How can we maybe give more visibility to examples that have less funding, for example? Yeah. And also, what if we collect from collecting quantitative data? Because I'm really excited now that I really thought I could only get through this research by collecting qualitative data, but what other quantitative data is out there that we could be collecting to learn about reuse? Okay, so my third stage of research was to do user interviews, and I did it in a really set order. So I first interviewed ADS depositors, and that was people who had deposited data with the ADS that data had subsequently been reused by someone else. And I wanted to know, do you know if your data has been reused? Do you know how people are reusing it? And the answer was not really, unless they've contacted me. Sometimes it would be an email from someone wanting help with the data set, or it might be someone approached them at a conference, but otherwise they have no visibility of that. I also then interviewed ADS users or reusers, depending on your definition of reuse. And I found out that most people actually belong to both categories. So people who reuse data are more likely to deposit data as well. And depositors likewise also reuse. But interestingly, ADS reusers aren't necessarily depositing with the ADS. So there's not really a brand loyalty or anything like that. What's really interesting about that is a survey done in the early 2010s looked at data sharing and it was a survey, and looked at if people share data, will others use it? And 54% of respondents said, yes, I share my data, but unless I get data from someone I know, I don't want to reuse like random data that I found out there, which is kind of interesting. You want other people to use your data, but you won't trust their data. And a more recent survey in 2019 asked slightly different questions, so they're maybe not 100% comparable, but suggested that people who reuse data are more likely to then share data, and that relationship is actually reversed. And that's quite interesting because that is also something that came through in my interviews. I had a few people who were reusing data and hadn't actually deposited yet, but had aspirations to do so in the future. And so I'm not sure like in which direction the relationship works, but I think that's something that really needs to be examined, because if reusers are more likely to deposit, we need to be encouraging more people to reuse in order to share more data. But I'm not sure that it's that clear cut. I think there's probably the relationship goes in both directions. I also interviewed an ADS staff member, some staff from other repositories, and a funding body. Now, when I interviewed the depositors and the reusers, something that really came through quite a bit was data quality. So quality is on 3 levels. So quality of the reports or archaeological outputs, quality of the data itself, and quality of the archaeological practice. So in terms of the reports, and specifically the people I was interviewing they were really using grey literature more than anything. And they said some of the feedback I got was what's in the reports it's quite brief, there's not enough detail. One of the comments I got from one of my interviewees was, it's amazing how archaeologists, when they find nothing at site, can write reams and reams. When something interesting comes up, I get 1 paragraph. The other thing that also came up is that people would really like for grey literature reports to follow a very specific format. If you're reusing a lot of grey literature and you're going in and every archaeologist writes in a different way, you then have to be going through and reading every piece of that grey literature report for everyone. But if it followed the same format, you go, okay, I'm just after this, I could go to that place in a report and find it. In terms of data quality is lacking, but this isn't necessarily a bad thing. What I found out was looking at other data that's poorly constructed helped interviewees to create better quality data. So basically learning what not to do when working with other people's data. Also, it can improve practice. So if you're looking at someone else's data, you're like, oh, I wish they had have taken an extra photo at this angle, or I wish they had have taken the time to do an extra measurement. When you're out on site, you think about your own data differently and what kind of photos or data that you're producing. And something else that came up that's quite interesting is I asked users about how do you address gaps in data, and I had thought that my question was about, like, in a specific data set, what do you do? I was trying to think of, like, is there some way to look at data quality and create some sort of workflow? But the question was misunderstood in the way that I asked, and people talked about the quality of the ADS data and their collection. And what they found was that, or what they said to me was, oh, things like regional reviews, they stopped in 2010, and now I have this big gap and I can't do anything about it. I have to go through and find all the reports myself. Why can't they keep those up? Well, the issue is funding, obviously. The ADS is at the mercy of its depositors. So the ADS doesn't determine what goes in there. And certainly they can make recommendations about funding, but at the end of the day, I really got this sense from interviews that people expect a lot more from the ADS than what the ADS is actually designed to do. And I guess it's about educating people actually what is the role of the ADS, and then what is the role of other bodies. So that also kind of leads into trust. So trust came up in the Seaton survey, and we asked 3 questions about trust all around metadata and whether or not metadata helps you build trust in a data set. And it was answered on a matrix of between, like, 1 is bad and 5 is good. And on the whole, the answers were quite neutral to positive, and that's not what we expected. We actually thought it would be quite low. And a suggestion was made at the workshop that maybe there's a shift in trust towards repositories. And actually this comes through in the literature and something that was just published in 2022. It also says that in terms of discipline-specific repositories, people are starting to see them as actually belonging to their user community. And so there is a shift in trust where it used to be down to individual researchers or institutions that now you will trust data found in a repository. I also asked, oh, I'm sorry, I've made that slide wrong. I also asked users about how they assess the reliability of data that they work with. And I was again trying to determine, is there something that we could do about developing a best practice or some sort of workflow of when you're approaching data? And people I interviewed all said, no, it's very contextual, it's subjective, it's specific. I think though, when you work with data reuse or working with other people's data is a skill set. And the more you do it, the more you develop that skill. And I suspect there's probably something subconsciously that when people look at a data set, they probably do have a tick box of a few things that they're looking for, but it's maybe not something that they can verbalize. But I only have anecdotal evidence. I can't definitely say that for sure. And I also asked repositories about trust and specifically around their ingest procedures and how they build trust in their data. And it really varies. So the ADS, for example, in their mission, it's that they provide archaeological data of reliable quality, or reasonable, sorry, I can't remember the exact word, reasonable quality or something like that. So ADS does not peer review the data. They go in, they check, have the file formats you've supplied an open format, can they be opened? You've not given any blank spreadsheets. They check that there are no fuzzy photos, etc. And doing that does add value to the data. They also make sure that your data is archived for long term, that it's interoperable. They do quite a lot of things to add value. But I think for some people, there was definitely an opinion that the quality of the data is also assessed, which it's not. Some other archaeological repositories do have more heavy-handed or play more of a part in editing that data, but again, they don't peer review the data. And so it's just interesting, there's all these different, again, it's projecting, I guess, what people want the ADS to be rather than necessarily looking at the ADS and seeing what they are. So I asked repository staff an aspirational question, which is, what do you want good, like, what do you think good reuse looks like? And all three of them said the same thing. What we really want is for people to come on here and build some context, help them improve their own practice. One of the examples given was, a commercial archaeologist might be going to a site or to an area they haven't excavated in before, and they'll go and look and see what other people excavated to find out like what they should be looking out for example. That's not necessarily citable though, and it's not something that I can track. It's only anecdotal. The second example given was about education. So the ADS provides resources for school teachers of younger children so that they can build like lesson plans and things. And one teacher created a lesson where children built Neolithic drums and then tagged the ADS in social media. And that's a really great example of outreach. It's public benefit. You're engaging a non-professional audience, all these great things. But if the ADS wasn't tagged in that social media post, they never would have known about it. So it's not traceable. And another example given to me by Open Context was about tertiary education and the importance of, with archaeology students, teaching them with real life data and giving them digital literacy skills. And they see this as like a long-term way of improving professional practice. But again, it's anecdotal and it can't be traced. So, and it's just kind of funny because here I am doing this research. The ADS is like, wow, we didn't know all these people are reusing our data, but actually what good reuse looks like isn't traceable. So, okay. So where to from here? One of the challenges that I really had trouble with at the beginning was a lack of baseline data for me to, or research for me to start from. I don't think I've necessarily like given that, but I've made dent, I've started, but I think there's so much more work that we still need to do. I would really love to collect some comparative data and do something similar at other repositories. I don't have time with my PhD to do that, but it would be really interesting to see I think probably because my research is very UK specific, and obviously commercial archaeology is such a large part of what we do, that there might be some differences or discrepancies with other countries, and it would be really interesting to see that picture. What are some of the benchmarks for value? So what other ways can we assign value to reuse other than just purely monetary? How do we define reuse? So I'm going to give a definition of reuse, obviously, as part of my work, but I don't think it's just up to me. I think as archaeologists, we need to come together and be asking broader questions about reuse, what we want it to look like, what do we think good looks like, and what definition we want. In my interviews, as I said, most archaeologists gave the different author definition, but when I questioned them further about it and said, well, could this be reuse? Could that be reuse? It was like, yeah. Particularly about the new purpose, as there was like a caveat, oh, you could, but it would have to be after some time. You could reuse your own data, but 5 years down the track, or on a different project or something like this. And so I think if we're going to be looking at reuse and the value that we place, we need to be having those conversations. Why is reuse hidden? Like, why is it? So DOIs are an ISO format that publishers were a part of creating. So why is it that the format that they've created and they've asked us to use, why doesn't that work? Why is reuse hidden? Can we not come up with some better way to track reuse? I've thought of some ideas, but I don't know how feasible they are. I think it's also really important, this research only looks at academic outputs. I think it's really important to look at, well, what does reuse look like for commercial archaeologists? I suspect there's a lot of informal reuse, and how do we place value on that so ADS can sort of go, in terms of funding, like, oh, this is our value. It's really important to invest in projects like regional reviews, because this is how much they use, this is how important they are in commercial archaeology, for example. And I don't necessarily think the outreach should be academic. I think maybe engaging them through commercial bodies might be one way to do that. And so what I would say is, when I came into this research, I really thought, is there some small change I can make to archaeological practice to help archaeologists reuse more data? And it was not necessarily a bright outlook. That's completely changed. I definitely have a much brighter outlook now. And I think, well, what small changes can we make to make examples of reuse more visible? How can we use existing examples to promote more reuse, to educate people, to create better quality data? Attitudes are shifting. How can we make them shift further? Not just within archaeology, but I think in terms of like funding and things like that. So yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
Any questions? No. Anyone on the chat have a question? Might get off lightly today. Yeah. Oh, is that Julian? I reckon. Go on, Julian.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well, actually.
Yeah. I just would say that was tremendous, KL. I mean, there's so many insights there and so much we could talk about. And just pick up a couple of themes, if I may, and we can carry on the conversation another time. But really interested by the things you raised about how far should archives be improving the quality of data that's deposited and sort of correcting things and making it better, which we've always resisted, I suppose. And there's also of course, it ties in with ideas of the preservation ethic in archaeology, where it's a lot of where this starts, and that the data is primary, and whatever someone has recorded, that's what we're charged with preserving as an archive, not what we think it should be. And that links in with reproducibility as well. I suppose in a science archive, someone might, in the future, we might think some of the results that someone got from an experiment were incorrect, their methodology was wrong, but nonetheless, for the data that's supporting their paper, we should still be preserving what they base their results on, even if there are mistakes in it. So I think that raises a whole range of interesting questions. And then just the second theme was about visibility. I'm sure you're right. There are real issues with visibility, particularly as the quantity of data that we archive grows. I mean, we've now got over 90,000 reports, over approaching 4,000 archives, and it starts to get really difficult to find individual things in that. And I think it raises questions of how far we should be trying to promote specific archives that we think are really good quality, but does that lead to a vicious circle that it's those archives that just get reused and reused again, if we highlight it, and is it the fact that archives that are cited in the literature then get reused more because they are cited, and other things get neglected? But yeah, they're not really questions, but just comments really sparked on by that. That was really stimulating. Thanks.
Comment in the chat that's pointing us to potential archaeology data sets.
Yes.
Read it out.
I can read it out. There are available GIS data sets at this website too. I will not read the web address, you can go there yourself. But again, it's the issue of quality and accuracy of the available data sets.
Yeah, some of the issues about accuracy as well is that there's a lack of trust in the person who collected the data, and that's why people want to use data from people that they know. But I mean, I've worked with some people who I question their, the way that they collect data. So I don't necessarily know that I wouldn't trust necessarily a stranger any less than that. But
Can I ask a question about, and this is as much a question sort of for Julian or James or anybody else who works in commercial archaeology in the country. So you've created a bit, you're seeing a correlation between things that are well-funded and how much reuse they see. And I'm just wondering if that's a true correlation or if it's the kinds of things, I mean, certainly with things that are like aggregates levy funded, people just have to consult them because that's just part of their job and it's nothing to do necessarily with the funding. And I could be misunderstanding that relationship completely. But I'm just wondering whether that link is as tight as it seems.
yeah, I'm not sure because I don't have anything to compare or to figure out like whether or not the funding is the thing. I think specifically with regional reviews, I think they just have really good visibility because for example, there are two that are about animal bones. Well, people who work in animal bones are constantly referencing them because that's their specialty. And that's kind of why I'd love to get some comparative data with other archives. There are things like that I think might be very specific to commercial archaeology in the UK that might not apply elsewhere. I don't know.
Julian, are those foundational? Are what we're talking about, is that sort of foundational to people doing work in commercial archaeology, and that's why they're so well reused as opposed to being well funded, do you think?
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, some of those archives we're talking about were deliberately created as reviews that would then be points of reference. It's like for as a reference collection, things that you go back to. But I think there's there are a number of factors, aren't there? And I think that well-funded projects also sometimes have outreach budgets, and they're also producing a lot of publications as well. And there must be a knock-on effect between visibility of publications. So, for example, the Roman Rural Settlement project that you cited, that has some very high profile and well-reviewed publications. So is it therefore a knock-on effect from that people then come to the data set as well? But yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the old aphorism, isn't there? If we build it, they will come, and that's certainly wrong. They won't, because no one will know about it. So you have to promote these things.
I mean, I also wonder as well with like rural settlements of Roman Britain, because you can go into the original report. What I'm wondering is if people are going into the database, because the number of downloads and views of that is so high. And yet if you go into the database and you find that initial report and you're citing the initial report as opposed to that database, I can't see that. And I know that it's happened with someone else that I interviewed and he's really frustrated. He's like, well, I'm not getting any recognition for this data set because people are citing the original
So it's
reference.
bypassing the DOI.
Yeah,
directly
and
to
that's
it.
not necessarily wrong though either, is it? Because you are citing the original author of that. So, I mean, the only way around I could think of that is like when you cite someone who's in another paper that you do something similar, like I use this data set in this paper, but I found it here in this location. I don't know.
Like secondary citation.
Yeah, secondary citation or something.
I mean, the whole thing, this issue around visibility is a problem, right? Because there's so much emphasis on impact in research and funding bodies as well. And I mean, there's a massive, if we're aware that there's reuse going on, but we can't map it, that's a huge, we do, you know, you're not able to assess the impact that they're having.
It's a lost opportunity.
It's a lost opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Yes.
I'm working in Dutch archaeological commercial unit. I'm mostly doing prospection. And Dutch archaeology is we are obligated to do research before we go into field. So we are actually reusing the old material or reports. But sometimes the quality of the report is lacking, or there is no reports at all. That's one thing. The other thing is like quality. Sometimes the information is not good provided or missing, or I have to cite it, but we don't do, because how they created the UI and dance is lacking in information, so I cannot use it properly. So there's also missing information, but for me, that is not a reuse, that there is no added value to this kind of research. It's just producing a new knowledge on top of the knowledge. The other thing is that when, for example, academia is doing the research, most of those people are from, they don't speak Dutch. So they cannot go back to Dutch reports and check the information. They have the, for example, some kind of binds, human bones, cemetery, whatever, but they can go back there and check what's there, because there is a language barrier. So it cannot be reused properly and create a proper added value to the whole data. So for me, it's a little bit infuriating.
Yeah, it's slightly